Hi everyone, I'm Jason Chan, currently working at Sidley Austin. Today I'm with Mr. Tim Freshwater, and I'm going to have an interview with him. So the first question, what motivated you to pursue a career in law?
Well, I got into it by accident really. I studied history at school and went to Cambridge. I had to decide what to study, and I decided that law would be useful in that I could either stay with it or I could switch to something else after I qualified. And when I qualified, when I finished my degree, I decided I might as well do the 2 years qualification. And having got that far, having done 6 years at that stage, I decided to stay with the law because I was enjoying it by then, and I'm very glad I did.
That's great. So can you kind of tell us about your legal practice when you joined Slaughter & May in 1967 and remained with them for 29 years? Kind of what happened? What are the exciting stories that you had?
There are many exciting stories. How long you got? I had a whole career with Slaughter & May, 29 years, as you say. I did, in the early years, Slaughter & May was, at that time, still is, a very major company and commercial law-based firm. It was then largely UK, but one of the reasons I joined them was they had some overseas practice even then, and I wanted to be international. I did a wide variety of corporate work and financial work. But then in 1973, I first got the opportunity to come to Asia, and I went to Hong Kong and then later to Japan. And that left me with a burning desire to work in Asia, and it was a time when for English lawyers in that area, there was a big need in Hong Kong. So I was very keen on my firm opening an office here, which they did in 1974, and for coming out here to work in that office as soon as I could. And I came out in 1978, and I worked then for 7 years here, and then went back and did another 11 years in London, mainly in the corporate M&A practice. Before I couldn't get Hong Kong out of my system really, so I got talked then into coming back here in '96, and at that point I retired from the law and switched to banking.
I see. So what prompted you to go to the Hong Kong office and then kind of transition back to London?
Yeah, well, Hong Kong was in '78 quite a small market. It was very attractive to me because it was very exciting as a place, and because a lot was happening on the legal front. As you'll know, it was a time of big expansion economically in the stock market and so on. A lot of international work starting, international fund management starting here, very little legal expertise in the key areas in Hong Kong, so there was lots to do. And as a young lawyer, it was very attractive because you quickly got to the decision-making level of your clients. You got heavily involved in things, whereas in the bigger centers, you had to wait for years before these things started. So it was very exciting for me. And I had a wonderful 7 years in Hong Kong. But I'd done a lot of work here. I built the firm up here. I'd done the job at the Law Society, which I'm sure we'll come on to.
Yes.
I'm an only child. Both my parents were rather old and sick. And I thought it was time to get back to London. I really thought I'd finished here. And it was only when I did get back to London that I realized that really Hong Kong was in my blood, and that sooner or later I'd probably want to come back again. But I had a very good 10 years in London before, as I say, I got tempted to come back out here, which I did in '96.
That's great. Was it very difficult to kind of build a practice in Hong Kong back then? Like, because Slaughter & May kind of, they were one of the first UK firms that came to Hong Kong and had a branch, right?
The first.
It was the first, so...
Just. Baker and McKenzie would argue about it. They were 2 weeks later.
Yes, so was it very difficult, and were there any huge challenges, say language or cultural?
Yes, we weren't very welcome. No names, no pectoral, but the partner who opened the firm was called Adrian Smart. And somebody wrote to the Law Society at that time saying because there was no Slaughter and no May in the firm of Slaughter & May, we couldn't be called Slaughter & May in Hong Kong. we had to be called Smart & Co.
Wow.
And we didn't want to be called Smart & Co. So that was an early difficulty, but
Yes.
we managed to overcome that with great help from the Law Society of Hong Kong. And then we didn't have to, we were lucky because as English lawyers we didn't have to requalify, of course, in Hong Kong. We could practice Hong Kong law. But there are areas where we were restricted, for example, property law. And obviously we lacked local expertise, and also there was limited amount of work, and competition was quite strong because a number of the London firms arrived at the same time. So it was quite a competitive environment, but very stimulating. When I was first here in the early years, there was a lot of turmoil in the markets. So there were a lot of bank insolvencies in the 81-82 period, and I got involved in the rescue of a number of banks. And it was those experiences then and the work that the HKMA did then that kept Hong Kong banking safe through the Asian crisis 15 years later. And actually, it was a very formative period for banking in Hong Kong, a tremendous expansion. But there was, and we were forming the rules of the stock exchange and the corporate scene were evolving very rapidly, and we had the Carrion affair, for example, which you may or may not have heard of, which resulted in criminal prosecution of somebody who was, in fact, the president of the Law Society, and other people, and huge commercial scandal extending right across all the professions, and we had other similar scandals like that. So that was much more exciting in some ways than it is now.
Yes.
I think.
It's more like the Wild Wild West kind of situation.
I mean, it looks like that now. It didn't really feel like that at the time, but certainly you had to be awake.
Yes, that's right. So in 2001, you joined Goldman Sachs Asia LLC as the chairman of Corporate Finance Asia. What made you kind of did that jump from a lawyer to kind of more a business role, or and what drew you to that role, and what happened there?
Well, it was pre-Goldman Sachs, although in fact I'd done work with Goldman Sachs. I sometimes say, which is true actually, that I was involved in starting the Goldman Sachs office in London in 1968, because I was an article clerk, signed the Memorandum and Articles Association of the Goldman Sachs UK.
Yes.
And then in Hong Kong, when I was at Slaughter in Hong Kong in 83, I helped set up the office of Goldman Sachs in Hong Kong in 1982 or 3. So I've known them for a very long time, but I didn't join them. I didn't come back to join them. I came back to join Jardine Fleming, which was then one of the leading investment banks in Hong Kong in '96, and was jointly owned by Jardine Matheson and by a British bank called Robert Fleming. And I came back there and finished up chairman there. But that bank was then sold and was now part of JP Morgan in 2000. So after 4 years, I was sort of out on the street again, or I think I was going to be out on the street again. And that's the time when I got asked to join Goldman Sachs. I decided to go there. But the real answer to your question is that I wanted to come back to Hong Kong. I did not want to come back to practice law in Hong Kong. I'd done that. I was very happy practicing law again in London. But because I wanted to come back to Hong Kong, I decided to retire from the law early. I was 51, and become a banker. And I did that, joined Jardine Fleming, and then when they were taken over, then I went to Goldman Sachs.
Okay. So why did you want to retire from the law per se? Like, were you kind of like over and done with, or was it, or you find that a bit more interesting, or at my age, I think that's more interesting?
More the latter. It certainly wasn't that I found banking more interesting than the law. It's not. Nothing's more interesting than the law to me. But 29 years was a whole career, basically.
Yes.
I'd done everything really that I wanted to do in the law. I could have gone on, but I didn't really want to go on doing that in Hong Kong, and I did want to come back to Hong Kong.
Right.
So you could say that coming back to Hong Kong made me leave the law probably 5 years earlier than I would have done otherwise, because the opportunity came to do something back here, and I took that.
I would imagine transitioning from like being a lawyer to more a business kind of role would be quite difficult? What were the kind of main challenges back then?
It was much more difficult than I thought it would be. You know, when you've been a lawyer, and I'm sure a lot of your members are lawyers, and well, they're all lawyers, a lot of them are corporate lawyers. Yes. When you sit around the table on deals, you think, well, I could sit the other side of the table very easily. Mm-hmm. But actually, it's not so easy.
Yes.
And I went into banking when I came back with Johnny Fleming, and 2 years later, we had the Asian crisis, mm-hmm. and I became the chairman. And I suddenly realized this was the real deal. You know, this was a little different from what I'd expected. Yes. And it was quite tough, mm-hmm. But quite character forming, and we got through it all right. So, but it's certainly a quite different way of looking at the same sets of circumstances. But one comment I would make, which may be relevant to your members, is that it's sometimes difficult to retire as a lawyer after a whole career as a lawyer and find other things to do. Your CV, people think of you as a lawyer. Mm-hmm. I didn't want people to think of me as a lawyer.
Yes.
By going into banking for a few years, it made me look slightly different to people, and I think actually has enabled me to keep interesting jobs until right up till now, until I really got quite old, which if I'd stayed purely as a lawyer after my mid-50s might have been more difficult. Because when I first arrived here, we had almost nothing to do that was related to the mainland of China. And even when I left in 1985 and went back to London, there was no way that you could buy exposure to the Chinese mainland economy on the Hong Kong stock market. You could buy Hopewell, and Gordon Wu had just started to build his road to Guangzhou. Yes. But apart from that, nothing. And today it's whatever it is, 90-odd% of new money, and easily the majority of trading.
That's right.
And so the world has changed very, very dramatically.
Yes. So after you left Slaughter & May, would you consider yourself an in-house lawyer in the bank?
No. In fact, one of the reasons I found it, I very nearly didn't do it, was I did not want to be an in-house lawyer. I had what I thought was the best job in the law as a partner of Slaughter & May, which I thought and think is one of the world's greatest firms.
Definitely one.
And I had very good practice. Why would I want to be an in-house lawyer? So when I joined Johnny Fleming, one of the reasons I chose them rather than, say, one of the American banks, is that I thought I knew them personally. I thought they would understand that I did not want a lawyer's job, and I didn't have one. I was part of the executive management team. The lawyers, in-house lawyers, didn't even report to me. They wanted someone with a legal background. That's a different matter. And the same when I got to Goldman Sachs. I've never been a lawyer. I think nowadays, it's a different profession from what it was then. And it's a very respectable and interesting profession. And a lot of the banks, of course, have major in-house legal teams. General Electric, for example, of America, which was my client when I was still at Slaughter & May, their in-house legal department was thought of being one of the best law firms in America itself. And so it's a very respectable profession, but I didn't want to be it because it was somewhere away from what they call these days the C-suite. And as a lawyer, I'd be used to dealing with organizations at the top level. That's what I wanted to continue to be.
You served as a council member from 1981 to 1985 and the president of the Law Society from 1984 to 1985. So what drew you to these leadership roles within Law Society?
Well, when I came here to live and to be a resident partner of Slaughter & May right at the beginning of 1979. I visited before that, but that was the first time I came to live. So I thought of nothing but trying to build the business of the firm, and I worked very hard, of course, as all lawyers do.
Yes.
And but then I was approached I think, when did I join the council? 81, did you
81,
say?
yes.
I was approached in 1981, so this was only my third year here. by John Wimbush, who was then, I think, probably vice president and was the senior partner of Deakins. And he asked me to become a member of the council. And I was worried about that because of the time commitment, but I thought that it was desirable, both for me to do it as an individual, but also that the incoming international firms, because they were all relatively new in Hong Kong then, should have a representative on the council, seemed to me to be a sensible thing. And I think, I mean, when I joined the council, it was largely, entirely made up of representatives from local firms, in which I include Deakins. There was actually no one from Johnson Stokes, which was the other big sort of expat firm, but Deakins was represented. But it was mostly local firms who were represented on the council, and I thought it was probably quite a good idea to bring that balance in. So I agreed to John's suggestion.
Were there any kind of memorable memories, moments that you would like to share with us during your service at the Law Society Council?
Oh, lots.
Perhaps one or two stories?
Well, I mean, the key thing, which I suppose we come to, is the Joint Declaration, of course.
Yes.
But before we get to that, I mentioned before the Commonwealth Law Conference.
Yes, of course.
That happened within a couple of years of my joining the council. That was a very important landmark in Hong Kong legal history, because everybody came to Hong Kong for that. And it sort of put a stake in the ground for Hong Kong as one of the key centres of the common law development, which it was, and I believe still is, actually. So that was very important. And also we had quite a lot of eventful things. There was still quite a lot of absconding going on after the collapse of the banks, and we had some fugitive lawyers, and the whole Carrion affair. And John Wimbush, who was the one who invited me onto the council, as you may recall, finished up, sadly, drowning in his own swimming pool in somewhat mysterious circumstances related, it was thought, related to that affair. So there was plenty of drama.
Yes.
And that was in my early years on the council. And then, of course, came '84, and I was very, very, very fortunate, because it was just my turn to be the president, and it happened at the time of the Joint Declaration.
Yes.
And although that, of course, was an agreement reached between the UK and China, and didn't involve Hong Kong as a party, but the UK side asked the Hong Kong government, or the governor, to take the advice of Hong Kong people, which they did quite extensively. And the Attorney General then, who's Michael Thomas, still around,
Yes.
Sent me as the president the draft of the Joint Declaration, invited me to circulate the profession and offer views, which I did.
Yes.
And I have to say, it was very interesting, and despite anything you may read in commentaries written by parties since, I can tell you that we didn't get a lot of response. Mostly lawyers. There were 1,200 solicitors then. They weren't, generally speaking, either they weren't really interested or they didn't really believe that there was going to be anything after 1997. And certainly the word democracy was never mentioned in any response. But we, within the council, and I personally, and lots of others too, felt it was crucial and fundamentally that we maintain the independence of the judiciary and the standard of the judiciary. And in particular, we were very keen that obviously previously the final Court of Appeal had been the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council in London. Well, obviously that wasn't going to be possible after 1997. So what do? Do we have a solely a Hong Kong court? We thought that it was highly desirable to have common law judges from other jurisdictions included in the final appeal court in Hong Kong. We asked for that. The British government supported it. We asked for 2, and pretty much to our surprise, basically, China agreed to only to 1, but they agreed, which I think was terrific at the time, And they have not, for 1 minute since then, resigned from that, and that is, as you know, is still the case today. Indeed, any questions about it today tend to come from the English side, which is particularly depressing for me, I must say, to hear. But I think that has proved to be very, very important. And to be part of the discussion of that at that time was a huge privilege for me. And I then, of course, just by virtue of being the president, was invited to be one of the 101 people who went up to Beijing to see the signing of the Joint Declaration in the Great Hall of the People in December 1984. Now, of that 101 people, I think I'm right in saying there are only 5 Guilos. So I was very, very happy to be one of those, and that's all thanks to the Law Society.
Would you say that was one of the, in a sense, greatest memories, or as a president, or as a council member?
Well, it's one of the greatest memories of my life. I mean, you have to. This is not just an event which doesn't happen very often.
Yes.
It had never happened before in history.
Yes,
and will never happen again. This was a unique historical event, and it was a huge privilege to be there. And I think it was that event which meant that once I got back to the UK, which I did a year later, I never lost the wish to come back, because I hadn't just spent a few years working in Hong Kong. I've been part of something which I thought then, and actually I still think, although there are all sorts of things going on today, I still think that it was a wonderful evolution of this concept beyond 1997, which is still going pretty strong, and which I'm completely committed to. And that's what I think brought me back here in 96.
I hope you didn't regret that decision.
I don't regret it. Well, here I am now. I'm
Yes.
more or less retired. I'm happy to say I can live pretty much in the world wherever I want to.
Yes.
There's only one place I want to live, and that's here in Hong Kong.
Oh. Do you think that the role of Law Society has changed since your time? What other changes, if you think there are any?
I haven't been involved myself, so I don't sit around the table of the Law Society, so I don't really know. I suspect that it's probably much broader. We were much more parochial, I think. We were concerned with our own professional affairs. The only political, apart from the Joint Declaration comments, the only political event I can remember during my time was an argument with the bar as to whether we should have one functional constituency or 2 functional constituencies. I thought the lawyers were doing pretty well, since there were only 1,500 of us altogether, to have one with a functional constituency, but the bar was pretty keen on having their own, I seem to remember. But generally speaking, there was very little of politics involved, and I suspect that the profile of the Law Society has probably increased since then. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, I leave it to others to decide, but it certainly makes life probably more difficult for the people running the Law Society now.
Are there still things on your kind of to-do or to-accomplish list? Do you want a third career? If so, what might it be? And can you tell us about them?
Well, I mean, no, I don't want a third career. But I have got a third career in a sense, in that I haven't been a practicing banker really for the last 12 years. But I've remained on the board of a number of institutions, both within Goldman Sachs and outside. So I sit on the board of Swire Pacific, for example, today, and Savills, the property consultant today, and a number of private companies. So I've had, if you like, a third career as a non-executive director, which, as I said earlier, I think I wouldn't have been able to have so easily had I not had the mixture of law and banking in my background. And I've thoroughly enjoyed that, because what happens is, as you grow old, that your energy, of course, declines, your ability to work hard declines, but you still think you still have value to bring, and this gives you an opportunity to do that, and of course maintain your interest.
I know that you did a lot of public service work, and you're on a lot of governmental advisory boards, such as the FSDC, the Exchange, TDC, and various SFC boards. What were some of the interesting things that happened when you served on these boards? And would you recommend solicitors of this day and age to do similar kind of public service work?
Okay. Well, I'll take the general first and come back from the particular of me. The general point is, in my time, Slaughter May didn't allow people to be on outside boards. And that's still quite common, I think, among law firms. I actually think that it is desirable to allow practicing lawyers to do outside roles, particularly in the latter part of their career, under proper controls. So, and I think you benefit from that. And going back to what I was saying earlier about your career suddenly coming to an end, a much better way of bridging that is to be able to leaven your last few years with some outside work. So I do think that's a good thing in principle. For myself, I've had some wonderful outside roles, but the most important, I think, looking back now, is clearly the stock exchange. I was in at the birth of HKX after the merger of the 4 exchanges here in 2000, very beginning of 2001. And I sat on the board for 12 of the next 18 years. Because I was appointed by government, I had to come off after 6 years. And then 6 years later, they rang up and said, would I come on again? So I did for another 6 years, so which ended in 2018. So I did 12 of those 18 years. Fantastically interesting. The stock exchange here, I think, is one of the key drivers of what has enabled the expansion of Hong Kong over that period. And they've had huge numbers of fascinating decisions during that time. And most recently, of course, we had the acquisition of the LME in London, beginning of my second term. And then we had the whole negotiation and fulfillment of the connections with China, notably Hong Kong-Shanghai Connect, Hong Kong-Shenzhen Connect, and then there's other connects that have come since. These, I think, have transformed the future of Hong Kong. So being, even in a small way as a member of the board, involved in those has been a tremendous excitement for me.
Thank you, Mr. Freshwater, for your time, and it was a very interesting interview, and I learned a lot from your stories, and it's just interesting to know what happened back then.
Thank you very much indeed. Now, I thoroughly enjoyed it. As I say, I'm really happy that you're doing this project in the first place. Thank you.